While we have spent most of the semester discussing learning, Chapter 12 focuses on the process of forgetting. Video 1 will actually define forgetting and look at how we go about measuring forgetting from a scientific perspective. Video 2 will then look at some reasons we forget, sources of forgetting, and some ways we can use this information and this research to understand different aspects of our life. So to start, what exactly is forgetting? In the field, we define forgetting as deterioration over time, or deterioration in performance, getting worse at performing a learned behavior following something we call a retention interval. A retention interval is any time period during which either learning or practice of a behavior does not occur. For example, while you're taking this class, you spend periods, intervals of time on the content, watching lecture videos, reading the book, looking at supplemental material. But you also spend periods of the semester not engaging with the material at all, not thinking about it, not looking at it. That's a retention interval. During these retention intervals, there's the possibility for deterioration of that behavior or that knowledge to occur. And that's what we refer to when we say forgetting. Any period of time when you're not using what you're learning that causes a deterioration. We talked in the last lecture video a little bit about stimulus control, how the context in which learning occurs can dictate when a behavior does and does not occur. And the same is true for forgetting. So, in this context, stimulus control still means that all behavior is elicited by the stimuli present during learning. You can think about you're currently learning in an online setting. Maybe you're sitting in your home office, your kitchen, your bedroom. That's your environment. You can think about sitting in a typical classroom, like pictured here. You're in a classroom, there's a desk, there's a podium, etc., etc. All of that context is going to contribute to retention of a behavior. Forgetting can happen sometimes when not all stimuli are present. For example, when you're sitting in a classroom learning, and then for some reason you have to change classrooms halfway through the semester. That lack of stimuli can actually impact your behavior and can sometimes cause forgetting. Although that example does not have a very big effect size, meaning that it's not going to change your test grade if you take it in your classroom versus a different classroom. Another example I have of how stimuli control impacts forgetting. Imagine for a second that you're a medical professional. You learn in med school to perform a certain procedure, and you learn that procedure in an operating room. Later on, you decide to be an army doctor or something like that, and you have to perform that same procedure in the field. Think about some stimuli that are present in that learning environment. You're in an operating room, there's nurses, there's a table, there's a light, etc., etc. All of those things that happen in an operating room, which clearly I only know about from watching Grey's Anatomy. Now think about what you would do if you had to perform that same procedure in the field, in the middle of nowhere, no medical facilities in sight. We know that difference in stimuli can actually impact how well we remember how to do those types of behaviors. And that's one way that forgetting can occur. Another way to look at forgetting is change in behavior due to the environment. Right? The environment in this situation is stimuli. We either stop doing a behavior, forget how to do a behavior because the environment changes. That's one way we can look at forgetting. Again, lack of certain stimuli causes the behavior to change. Now I want you to think about how we defined learning at the beginning of the semester. Change in behavior due to the environment. Learning and forgetting are actually very similar processes. However, forgetting and learning are not the same thing. When we're talking about learning, we're building something, we're acquiring something, adding something. And when we're talking about forgetting, you're seeing deterioration, we're losing something. So it's important to remember that these two processes happen in a very similar way, but with opposite outcomes. You might also be wondering how exactly forgetting is different from extinction. If you think back to operant and classical conditioning, we've talked a good bit about extinction. But these two are not the same thing. I'm going to restate: extinction is learning not to perform a behavior, if you forgot what extinction is. Basically, there's lack of reinforcement in the environment, and we no longer perform a behavior because we're not being reinforced for it. That's what extinction is. Forgetting is actual degeneration of a behavior because we don't have the opportunity to perform it. So although extinction and forgetting both involve the response or in the environment, extinction has to do with how the environment is responding to a behavior, and forgetting has more to do with whether or not the behavior is allowed by the environment. So again, extinction, you might have the opportunity to perform that behavior, but you don't have a reason to, so you stop doing it. Forgetting, you don't have the opportunity to perform the behavior. That brings us to how exactly we measure forgetting. And I really like this section a lot because it actually, I think from a student's perspective, teaches us a good bit about how we assess learning in academia. So you've likely seen this blue book before. If you've ever taken a class that had an essay exam, you have seen the blue book, the dreaded blue book. This kind of essay approach to assessment is something called free recall. So imagine that I walked into a classroom this morning and I asked you to get out a piece of paper and write an essay on learning. How would you feel about that? Most of you would probably be pretty freaked out. You would probably have that feeling we get when we're told to do assignments like this, where you feel like you don't know where to start. You don't know what to include, nothing's coming to you. Free recall is what happens when we provide an individual a chance to perform a behavior. And that's it. I say, do this behavior. And it is completely up to you to summon up all of the information, all of the experiences, everything you need to perform that behavior. Again, essay questions are sometimes a good example of free recall. It depends how specific they are. What are some pros and cons you think this approach has? As a professor, I really like essay tests, but you'll notice I do not include them in our class. Students don't tend to like them very much. The biggest reason I don't use essay questions is or essay tests most of the time, is because they take a lot longer to grade, and I like to get your grades back fast to you, and because I know students are very uncomfortable with them a lot of the time. We'll talk a little bit more about multiple choice versus essays in a second. However, ideally, I would always have students do essay exams because it gives me a better idea of what you're learning. I have given you no prompt. I have given you no vocab words to look at and think of. I've just asked you to tell me what you learn. And in that sense, free recall is actually a better assessment of how much learning has occurred. But there are other methods, of course. Prompted or cued recall is where you give a hint or a prompt that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring. For example, if I gave you an essay question that was more specific, for example, write an essay on how extinction and forgetting are the same and different. That's prompted because I've given you those words. I've kind of set up that relationship in your head a little bit. It's not completely up to you. So prompted and cued recall tend to be a little more appreciated by students, but might not necessarily allow us to assess how much learning has occurred as well. Short answers or fill-in-the-blank questions are also great examples of prompt cued recall. They tend to have more cues than a more specific essay question. And then we have recognition. And this is where our multiple choice tests come in. Recognition is where you identify material associated with the behavior. I show you two pictures of something and I say, which one is it? You only have to look at those pictures and identify which one is correct. You don't have to summon up as much material yourself. There's a lot more provided for you. Multiple choice tests are recognition-based. You have the answers, usually there's 4 of them, and all you have to do is recognize which one of those is correct. You don't have to summon up a lot of the time that information yourself. Now, a good multiple choice test, which I hope is what I'm capturing, and I have data to support this, when you take my multiple choice tests, make you do more of that free recall. But those words are still there for you, so you don't have to remember the answer yourself. There's another method that we tend to not use as much in academia, but do use in research a lot of the time, called relearning. And this is where we measure the amount of training required to bring a behavior back to its original state. Imagine, for example, that you're part of a master's program. You take a bunch of classes over the years, and at the end of your time as a graduate student, you take something that we call a comprehensive exam. That quizzes you, tests you over everything you've learned while you were a master's student. You have to spend some time studying for that. So you review, you relearn all of the information that you once knew. If we were to track how long it took you to relearn that information, that would be using relearning as a tool to measure forgetting. Another example, if I re-explained what classical conditioning was to you right now, and measured how long it took you to grasp the concept, that would be measuring relearning. This can teach us a lot about how stable information is over time, how prior learning impacts later learning, and so on and so forth. That brings me to the end of video 1. We will pick up with video 2, looking at sources of forgetting.